Okay, so you know how we do these deep dives. And for
Yeah,
this one, you folks have given us some really fascinating material.
absolutely.
Excerpts from Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel
A
Kahneman.
classic.
And our goal here is to try to really distill the essence of how our minds work
Yeah.
without, kind of getting lost in the weeds or the jargon or
Right, right.
all those technical terms.
Yeah.
Think of it as like an express route to understanding your own mind and all of its quirks and patterns.
Yeah, you're the kind of person who wants to understand things quickly and deeply and appreciate those aha moments
Okay,
without getting bogged down.
exactly right.
So, in this deep dive, we are going to be looking at this interplay between our fast, intuitive thinking and our slower, more deliberate reasoning.
So two systems
Two
there.
systems, exactly.
Yeah.
And we're going to be uncovering some really predictable quirks about how we make judgments and choices in our lives.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at how our minds take shortcuts, why we make certain kinds of predictable errors, the crucial role of attention, and even how our experiences and our memories shape who we think we are.
That's a great summary.
So let's just jump right in.
Let's do it.
Okay, so we've got these two systems of thinking,
Yeah.
system one, system two.
That's right.
Can you give us kind of the thumbnail sketch of each of those?
Sure. So, system one is that really fast gut feeling part of your mind. It's the automatic pilot, so it's intuitive, it's very emotional. Think of it as, if you see an angry face, you instantly know that the face is angry. You don't have to think about it.
Yeah, it's immediate, it's effortless, just pops right up.
It does. And then you have system two, which is, the slower, more analytical part of your mind. So this is what you engage when you're tackling a complex problem or you're focusing intently on something or you're, consciously working through something.
So system two is the one that takes effort. It's the mental heavy lifting.
Yeah.
I love how Kahneman compares it to a physician learning the language of medicine,
Yeah.
right?
That's a really apt analogy.
Like a doctor learns all these specific terms,
Mhm.
and that allows them to see patterns of illnesses that, a layperson wouldn't be able to see.
Totally.
And he's saying the same thing is true of our thinking.
Yes.
If we can learn kind of a richer vocabulary about how we think and why we make the decisions we make,
Mm-hmm.
then we can see these patterns that otherwise would remain hidden.
Exactly. And one of the interesting things that comes out of that is that these distinctive patterns in the errors people make are predictable.
Yeah.
So we tend to stumble in specific ways under certain conditions.
So that's great news.
Yeah, well, it's good and bad.
Well, I mean, good news for us trying to understand our minds.
Exactly.
Right.
Like, okay, there are these certain patterns, and if we can, if we can become aware of those patterns, we can potentially avoid them.
Right, or at least recognize them when they're happening. So one of the things that leads to these predictable errors are what are called heuristics,
Yes.
which are basically mental shortcuts.
That's right. Rules of thumb that help us to make quick decisions, so it's not like they're bad. It's that they're really helpful in most situations.
Right.
But sometimes those shortcuts lead to systematic errors, which are biases.
Okay, so heuristics are the general strategies, and the biases are the actual errors in thinking that can result.
Right. So think of the heuristic as a mental tool that gives us the wrong measurement sometimes.
Okay.
But it's still a useful tool in many situations.
Right.
Just not all situations.
Okay, so let's look at an example of one of those.
Yeah.
What about the availability heuristic?
Yeah, the availability heuristic is the tendency to judge how frequent or how likely something is based on how easily examples of it come to mind.
The easier something is to think about,
The more frequent you think it is.
the more common we think it is, right?
Right.
Like the classic example with the letter K.
Exactly. So if you think about the letter K, you're more likely to think that it appears more often as the first letter of a word,
Right.
simply because it's easier to retrieve words that start with K, like Kate or key, versus words where K is the third letter.
Right, like acknowledge.
Exactly. And Kahneman talks about how this can skew our perceptions in broader ways. So, he reflects on his own, long-held belief that infidelity was more common among politicians than doctors or lawyers.
Right.
And he realized this was probably because politicians' scandals are so much more publicly reported.
Right, if a politician has an affair, it's all over the news.
That's right. It's in the headlines.
Right, a doctor or a lawyer has an affair, nobody cares.
Right. And so that ease with which those stories came to mind created a false sense of frequency.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily the actual frequency, it's just the availability in our minds that we tend to latch on to.
Right. That readily available information can distort our view of reality.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I'm sure you can think of similar examples in your own life.
Oh, absolutely.
Where what you hear about more often feels more common, even if the data might say otherwise.
Right, yeah, it's just our brains taking a shortcut.
Right. Based on what's easily accessible in our memory bank.
Okay, so that's the availability heuristic.
That's one example.
What's another heuristic that we should be aware of?
Another example is the halo effect. And this is where a generally positive impression of someone influences how we judge their specific traits. So if you find someone charismatic, you might automatically assume they're also more competent or trustworthy. So it's like one positive trait casting a halo over others.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay, so we've talked about how these kind of quick intuitive judgments that are powered by System 1 can lead us down the wrong path. But System 1 is not all bad, is it?
No, not at all.
I mean, it allows us to do some pretty amazing things.
Yeah, think about driving a car or, reacting instantly to catch something that's falling.
Right.
These are often seamless automatic actions that happen without, much deliberate thought at all.
We can feel almost magical.
Yeah, but, as Kahneman reminds us, quoting Herbert Simon, intuition is nothing more and nothing less than recognition.
Well, that's a good quote.
So it's not some, mystical power. It's the result of extensive practice and the ability to recognize familiar patterns and cues.
So it's basically just a lot of experience built up over time.
That's right.
Like a chess master.
Exactly. A skilled chess player instantly recognizes a threatening board position based on years of experience. So, the situation provides the cue, and that unlocks all of this relevant information, and it leads to an intuitive answer.
But it's not magic. It's just lots and lots of experience.
Right.
Okay, so that's System 1.
Right.
Operating on autopilot.
And mostly.
But then System 2 has to jump in when we need focus and effort and mental energy.
Exactly. System 2 is what we need for those tasks that aren't routine or automatic.
Right.
So, think about trying to remember everyone you met at a conference last year, or the mental strain of, navigating a new accounting system or something like that.
Right. Or learning a new language or some
Right.
skill
Yeah, exactly.
that requires focus and effort.
Right. And it requires you to maintain your focus and, work through these unfamiliar processes. And that takes conscious effort.
And this effort that we feel when we engage System 2, it's not just a subjective feeling.
Right.
Like Kahneman and his colleagues actually measured physiological responses like pupil dilation and heart rate.
That's right.
And they found that during demanding mental tasks, like doing mental multiplication or remembering a long string of digits, our pupils dilate.
Yes, they get bigger.
And our heart rate increases.
And they also found that when participants were given more information than their working memory could handle, their pupils would actually start dilating or even shrink.
Wow.
Almost like the brain was saying, nope, I'm done.
Like I'm overloaded.
Exactly. I can't take anymore.
That's so fascinating that we can actually observe physically the limitations of our cognitive abilities.
Yeah, it's a physical manifestation of our cognitive load.
Yeah.
And it really underscores how limited the capacity of System 2 is.
Yeah.
And it can become overloaded very easily.
Yeah. And that makes me think of that famous invisible gorilla experiment.
Yeah.
Have you heard of that one?
Oh, yeah, of course.
So they show people this video of these basketball players passing a basketball back and forth.
Right.
And they ask the participants to count how many times the players in the white shirts pass the ball.
Right.
And people get really focused on this task.
They do.
And then midway through the video, a person in a gorilla suit walks right through the scene.
Right through the middle of the players.
And beats their chest and everything and then walks off and then the video ends and the researchers ask the participants,
did you see anything unusual?
Right.
And a huge percentage of people don't even notice the gorilla.
They're so focused on counting the passes that they completely miss this very obvious thing.
That's inattentional blindness.
Inattentional blindness, yeah.
So when your System 2 is engaged in this really demanding task, in this case counting the passes, you become surprisingly oblivious to other things that are happening around you, even if they're pretty obvious.
Even if a gorilla walks by.
Exactly.
So that shows how limited our attentional resources really are.
It does.
Okay, so we've got System 1, which is good at quick pattern recognition and, kind of simple associations.
Right.
But System 2 is what we need to engage for more complex operations.
Right.
Like following rules and making comparisons and deliberate choices and, doing logical and statistical reasoning.
That's right.
And one of the things that System 2 is responsible for is what's called executive control.
Yes.
Which is our ability to manage our tasks and to switch between them and to override those impulsive responses that System 1 is always trying to throw at us.
Exactly.
So, if you're trying to proofread a document carefully, or if you're, trying to count how many times a certain letter appears in a paragraph, or if you're trying to, work through a complex budget,
Right.
these are all tasks that don't come naturally.
They require you to engage System 2
Right.
and to maintain that focus.
And they're tiring.
They are effortful.
And that's why we have this natural tendency to operate by what Kahneman calls the law of least effort.
Yeah.
Which is just we're trying to avoid mental overload.
Right. We want to conserve our mental energy.
Right. Our brains are wired to be efficient.
They are.
They're always looking for the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
And this leads to an interesting idea, the concept of a shared pool of mental energy.
Yes.
So the idea is that all forms of voluntary effort, whether it's cognitive effort or emotional effort or even physical self-control,
They all draw from the same pool.
all draw from the same pool.
Yeah.
So it's like
Fine.
we have a limited amount of mental energy.
That's right. A finite amount.
And if we use it up in one area,
It's depleted.
we're weaker in other areas.
Yes. And this is the basis of ego depletion.
Ego depletion.
Yeah, which is a term coined by the psychologist Roy Baumeister.
Right?
And he did some fascinating experiments.
Right, like the one where people had to resist eating cookies.
Right. So participants who had to suppress their emotions while watching a really sad film showed less persistence later on when they were trying to solve a difficult puzzle.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. Or, the one you mentioned about the cookies,
Yeah.
where people resisted eating delicious, freshly baked cookies.
Right.
And then they gave up sooner on a difficult cognitive task compared to those who hadn't had to exert that initial self-control.
So it's like resisting the cookies
Depleted them.
depleted them, right? And so they didn't have the energy to then do the cognitive task.
Exactly.
So we have to be aware that engaging System 2 takes energy,
Yes,
and we have a limited supply.
we do.
And if we're not careful, we can become depleted.
We can.
And that can lead to what Kahneman calls intellectual sloth,
Right.
which is basically a tendency to avoid effortful thinking. And, one way to kind of measure how prone people are to intellectual sloth is the cognitive reflection test.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of this.
It's a short quiz with questions that seem really easy at first,
Mm-hmm.
but are actually designed to trigger an intuitive but incorrect answer.
Yes.
And people who score low on this test tend to just go with that first readily available answer
Yeah, they don't stop to think about it.
without engaging System 2.
They're going with their gut,
Right.
their intuition.
And it suggests that they're a little bit impulsive and maybe a little impatient with deliberate thought.
Maybe a little bit lazy,
Right.
intellectually lazy.
Yeah.
But, on the other hand, people who score highly on this test tend to be more intellectually curious. They actively seek out information, and they're more skeptical of their initial intuitions.
Right. They're always double checking.
Exactly. And psychologist Keith Stanovich links this to the concept of rationality.
Okay.
So people who are more rational are more willing to invest the effort that's needed for careful reasoning.
So they're willing to push past that initial gut feeling
Exactly.
and really think things through.
That's right.
Okay, so we've talked about these two systems, System 1 and System 2.
Right.
And now let's kind of dive a little deeper into the foundation of System 1,
Okay.
which is associative memory
Yeah.
and the phenomenon of priming.
Okay.
So the basic idea here is that, when we encounter a word or an image or even just a subtle cue,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't just exist in isolation in our minds.
Right. It's connected to a whole network of related ideas.
Right.
And it automatically activates that network.
And so Kahneman gives a great example of this. He says, imagine the words bananas vomiting.
Oh, yeah.
You read those two words together, even though they're not typically linked, in everyday life.
Right.
They instantly trigger all these related concepts in your mind, like sickness,
Disgust.
disgust, maybe even the color yellow.
The texture of banana.
Right. And your System 1 also quickly registers that this is kind of an unusual pairing. And so you might feel a little sense of surprise or discomfort.
Yeah. It's like, why are these two words together?
But the point is that all this happens really fast.
Yes, it does.
And it happens automatically
And unconsciously.
without any conscious effort on your part.
It does.
So this is what's happening under the surface
Yes.
all the time.
All the time.
These associations are being made.
These connections are being fired.
And, this leads to the idea of priming,
Yeah.
which is basically this fascinating demonstration of how subtle cues can influence our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
Yes.
So, for instance, if You are briefly exposed to words related to old age,
Like Florida.
like Florida or wrinkles.
Or bingo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You might subconsciously start walking a little slower afterward.
Yeah, isn't that strange?
It's so weird.
Yeah.
Or if you see the word eat, you're temporarily more likely to complete the word fragment, S-O-P,
As simpy.
as soupy rather than soap.
Right?
So it's like these subtle cues are kind of shaping our responses
Yeah.
without us even realizing it.
It's like our mind is being primed
Primed.
to
Right.
think in a certain way.
And all of this connects to the idea of cognitive ease and strain.
Yes.
So Kahneman describes this as a kind of a spectrum from feeling easy to strained,
Yes.
which basically reflects how smoothly our brains are processing information at any given moment.
Right. So cognitive ease means things are feeling familiar, they're coherent, and, generally good.
Right, like everything's okay.
Yeah, there's no immediate threat. You don't need to engage system 2 for deeper analysis.
You can just coast.
Exactly. You're just cruising along.
Right. But cognitive strain, on the other hand, indicates that something feels unfamiliar or incoherent.
Right. Or it requires more effortful processing.
Right.
And so that's when system 2 has to get involved.
Right. And here's the key insight.
Okay.
This feeling of ease or strain can actually influence our judgments and our beliefs.
That's right.
So, for example, statements that are easier to process, like maybe because they rhyme or they're in the clear font or
They've been repeated.
they've been repeated,
Familiarity breeds a sense of truth.
they tend to feel more true,
Yeah.
even if the content is totally inaccurate.
Yeah. And even partial repetition can be effective.
Oh, really?
So if one part of a statement is familiar because of prior exposure, the entire statement can feel more credible,
Oh, wow.
even if you don't consciously remember encountering that specific phrase before.
So that's something to watch out for.
It is.
Yeah.
Repetition is a powerful tool.
So we have to be careful about, just because we've heard something a lot,
Doesn't mean it's true.
it doesn't mean it's true.
Right.
And our mood also has a big impact on this feeling of cognitive ease.
Yes, it does.
So a good mood tends to relax the vigilance of system 2.
Making us more susceptible to errors in judgment,
Right.
but also potentially making us more creative.
More creative. Yeah.
More intuitive.
Right. So if you're in a good mood, you're more likely to just go with your gut,
Right.
but you're also more likely to come up with new ideas.
Right.
But then a bad mood, on the other hand, can trigger a more analytical and cautious mode of thinking.
That's right.
So when you're in a bad mood, you're less likely to make those kind of snap judgments,
Yeah.
but you're also less likely to be, kind of free-flowing and creative.
Right. So there's a trade-off.
There is
Yeah.
always a trade-off.
Okay, so we've talked about heuristics and biases,
Right.
and we've talked about cognitive ease and strain.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about some other illusions that our minds are prone to, like
Yeah.
illusions of remembering.
Okay.
So Kahneman talks about this example of David Stenbill,
Right.
which is a made-up name.
Right.
But if you see that name on a list, and then you encounter it again later, mixed with the names of real celebrities, you might mistakenly think that David Stenbill is also a celebrity.
Yeah. Simply because the name feels familiar?
Simply because it feels familiar.
Yeah. It's like that sense of vague familiarity without a specific memory of where you encountered the name before.
And your brain misattributes that feeling of recognition to him being famous.
So it's like he becomes famous overnight
In your own mind.
in your own mind.
Right.
Yeah.
Just because you've been exposed to the name a
Right.
couple of times.
That's so interesting.
It is.
And our perception of what's normal or abnormal can also be easily swayed.
Oh, absolutely.
So Kahneman gives this example of a dinner guest who winces after tasting the soup.
Right.
And that one single unexpected reaction can shift your baseline expectation
Right.
for how other people are going to react to the same soup.
Totally.
So if another guest is hesitant to try the soup, or if the chef seems really concerned about the soup,
That seems less surprising.
all of a sudden those events seem less surprising.
Right, because the first event has kind of altered what we consider to be the norm in that situation.
Right.
So one data point can really change our perception of what's normal.
Totally, yeah.
It's powerful.
Okay, and then we have this thing where System 1 is always striving to create explanation.
All right.
To see cause and effect relationships, even where there is no actual causal link.
Yes, we're storytelling creatures.
Right.
We're always trying to come up with a story.
And so Kahneman talks about these classic experiments
Yes.
by Michaud and Heider and Semmel.
Right.
So Michaud did these experiments with moving shapes
Right, just like squares and circles moving around on a screen.
And he showed how we automatically attribute physical causality to these shapes.
Like one square pushing another.
Right. Like one square bumps into another square,
Yeah.
and we assume that the first square caused the second square to move,
Yeah, even though it's just an animation.
even though it's just an animation.
Yeah, okay.
And then Heider and Simmel did this really interesting experiment with a film of a large triangle, a small triangle, and a circle.
Right, and people watching this film couldn't help but see intentions and emotions.
Right.
And they would even create little narratives.
Like the big triangle was a bully.
Right, and the little triangle and the circle were trying to escape.
Right.
And it's just shapes moving around on a screen.
It's amazing.
But we can't help but impose a story.
Yeah, our minds are just wired to look for agents and motivations.
They are.
And that leads to what Gilbert calls the bias to believe.
Yes.
So his research suggests that our initial processing of information actually involves accepting it as true.
Right, we automatically believe what we hear.
And then doubting or unbelieving actually requires effort from system 2.
It does.
So it's like we're kind of predisposed to believe things.
Yes, we are.
And unless our system 2 kicks in and says, wait a minute, hold on, let me think about this,
Right.
we're just going to accept whatever we're told is true.
And this makes us potentially vulnerable to believing almost anything when System 2 is busy or not fully engaged.
Like imagine you're scrolling through social media and you're tired or distracted.
Yeah.
You're just going to accept those headlines and those little snippets of information as true.
Right, because your System 2 is not really alert enough to say, wait a minute, is this really true?
And this is all connected to what Kahneman calls WISIety.
What you see is all there is.
What you see is all there is.
Yeah.
And the idea here is that System 1 is really good at creating a coherent story
Right.
based on limited information.
Based on whatever's available.
So it just takes whatever's in front of it
Yeah.
and tries to make sense of
Oh,
it.
it fills in the gaps.
It fills in the gaps.
To create a story that makes sense.
And so he gives this example of, imagine someone tells you that Will Mendick is articulate and intelligent,
Right.
and then immediately you conclude that he would be a good leader.
Right, because those two traits seem like they would be important for a leader.
Right, but you're only given those two pieces of information.
Right.
You don't know anything else about Will Mendick.
Right.
But your System 1 is already jumping to conclusions,
Creating the story.
creating a story
Based on limited data.
based on limited data.
Right.
And this tendency to jump to conclusions based on what you see is all there is.
Right.
Can also lead to errors when we evaluate one-sided evidence.
So in the legal scenario where you're told only that David Thornton was handcuffed in a drugstore,
Right,
your initial inclination might be to think that the drugstore acted unfairly
right,
without, having any information about why they might have done so.
right. We don't know the full story,
That's right.
but we're already making judgments.
We are.
And so this is why it's so important to actively seek out missing information.
Right.
And to try to get independent perspectives
To get the full picture.
to get the full picture,
Yeah.
to kind of counteract this tendency to just rely on what's immediately in front of us.
Right.
And then another thing that System 1 is doing all the time is it's constantly making these basic assessments of our environment
Right.
without any conscious direction from System 2.
Tapping in the background.
It's happening in the background.
Right.
So things like similarity, like how
Yeah.
much does this resemble something I already know?
Yeah.
Causality.
What caused that?
What caused that, right?
Mhm.
Availability.
How easily does this come to mind?
How easily does this come to mind?
Yes.
These are constantly being evaluated in the background.
They are.
And these basic, readily available assessments can often be substituted for more complex or difficult questions.
Right.
And that's actually a core mechanism behind many of these heuristics and biases.
Exactly.
So it's like our brain has this mental shotgun.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
When System 2 directs it to evaluate one specific attribute,
Right.
System 1 automatically fires off a whole range of related computations.
Yeah, it can't help itself.
It can't help itself.
It's like it's got a hair trigger.
And so this leads to all sorts of interesting effects.
Right.
Like, for example, research by Todorov
Mm-hmm.
shows that we tend to judge competence based on facial features,
Yeah.
like a strong jawline
Right.
or a confident smile.
like a trustworthy face.
Right.
Yeah.
Even though these features are actually very poor predictors of job performance.
Yeah, they're not really related to competence at all.
But our System 1 is just making these quick, intuitive judgments
Based on superficial cues.
based on superficial cues.
Yeah.
And System 1 also deals with sets and prototypes in a really automatic way.
Right.
So for example, if you look at a group of objects, you can instantly get a sense of the average size or color
Right.
without having to individually measure or analyze each one.
Yeah, it's just an automatic computation.
And it's effortless.
It is.
And then the way questions are framed, or the order in which they're asked, can surprisingly influence our answers.
That's right.
So for example, if you ask someone about how happy they are with their dating life,
Right.
right before you ask them about their overall happiness,
Right.
that can lead to the dating aspect disproportionately affecting their reported life satisfaction.
Right, because it's top of mind.
It's top of mind.
Exactly.
And that's WISIAD at play again.
What you see is all there is.
What you see is all there is.
Yeah.
Whatever's top of mind has an outsized impact.
It does.
And then this connects to the affect heuristic, where our emotional responses, our likes and dislikes, really drive our judgments and decisions.
So we're not as rational as we think we are.
We think we're making these logical decisions,
Right.
but often we're just letting our feelings
Guide us.
guide us. Right?
And sometimes that's okay.
Right.
But sometimes it leads us astray.
And we also have this kind of intuitive belief in the law of small numbers,
Yes.
where we tend to expect small samples to perfectly mirror the characteristics of the larger population they come from.
Right.
So we overestimate the significance of limited data.
Yes.
Even researchers can fall into this trap.
They do all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's easy to overinterpret results from studies with very few participants.
Right.
Because it's hard for us to really grasp randomness.
Right.
We're looking for patterns.
We're looking for patterns and causal explanations.
Yes, even in random sequences like coin flips.
Right. Or the gender of newborns.
Right, we see streaks.
We see streaks or hot hands.
Where there's just noise.
Where there's just statistical noise. And then we have anchoring effects.
Yes.
Which is this really weird phenomenon
Yes.
where simply considering a particular value for an unknown quantity can influence our final estimate.
Even if that anchor is completely arbitrary?
Even if it's totally irrelevant.
Yeah, like the classic example of asking about Gandhi's age.
Right.
After first asking if he was older or younger than 140.
140. Right.
And then people's estimates of Gandhi's age are wildly different.
Right, depending on whether they were given that high anchor or a low anchor.
Exactly.
It's like our minds get subtly biased by that.